let's go back a bit. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and tell us about your upbringing. Way back. Childhood.
So I think the reason my upbringing matters is because it matters more towards my entrepreneurship story, right? The start was, well, when two people love each other. No, my parents, they left Sri Lanka sort of late 70s, and through that time Sri Lanka was going through a lot of kind of civil unrest, I guess, and they decided actually, there's better opportunities overseas. Africa was doing a drive for education, so they were hiring degree qualified people to become teachers in Africa. So they ended up meeting in Nigeria, and then sort of immigrated to Zimbabwe. I was actually born in Sri Lanka, but I grew up in the first sort of 10 years of my life in Zimbabwe, in Africa. And then in general, my dad left Nigeria because he saw that kind of going downhill, ended up in Zimbabwe, and then kind of saw that going downhill, so he took off to New Zealand. So I had this joke, basically, if you ever hear about my dad leaving New Zealand, don't ask any questions, just gap it. But basically, we settled in New Zealand in the mid-90s and saw out most of my education about 10 years old when that happened.
So did you study here in New Zealand?
Yeah, so I in Africa they prioritize math quite high. So when I landed here, I sucked at reading. I sucked at pretty much everything else, but my math was really good. So I entered Standard 2, which was like
Standard
year.
Standard 3.
I don't know what that is, like year 3 or something. I don't know. Whatever. It's like really low level. And I skipped a few grades and then sort of saw my primary school, intermediate, high school, all in Abeysuria High down south. So yeah. Nice.
That was brilliant. And then, so after high school, where did you go to university?
Yeah, so University of Auckland, because it was the next obvious place to go. I actually didn't get into the engineering school.
What did you get into?
No, so that you needed 320 bursary points to get into engineering. So my calculus and my stats and my physics were great, but I had taken design and geography, so graphic design and geography, which, and I literally remember going to the interview and the interviewer going, if you didn't do design or geography, you would have gotten in. And I was like, yep. And that was my engineering interview. Yeah. So I got into the School of Engineering, got through that, did software, and then started Rush only a year after that.
Right. And your time at the university, what was that like?
To be honest, I didn't spend a lot of time at university. First year, second year. So one thing I found out about myself is that I don't learn how other people learn. So I'm not a very audible learner. So you should ask anyone that works with me actually. If you're just talking to me, I'm not hearing anything. So basically you have to write it down, or you have to get me to do it, or I have to write it down or draw a sketch or something like that. I'm very visual. So I just never found that the way that the university taught, they're catering to a mass audience, and I'm some kind of freak. So I just didn't get a lot of value from doing the lectures the traditional way. So what I would do is just get the course materials, and then about a month out from exams, kind of just go to the library, study all the course material, and then go to the exam and get it done.
Yeah, it's a good thing that attendance wasn't what you were being marked on, then, I guess.
Yeah, I actually failed a couple of things that had the attendance component, and then had to earn it back on the exam.
So I didn't know you did graphic design. Do you do design anymore?
Yeah, I think not a lot of people know this, but I can actually draw and stuff. It's part of the versatility, I think. Right brain, left brain. It's probably why Rush is the way it is in a lot of ways.
Sure. I saw you've done quite a bit of freelancing and whatnot. Was that design, or was it a different area?
No, so I never had a computer growing up. The early years, all through when we were in Africa and stuff, never had a computer, never really touched a computer, and then probably third form, so just at the start of intermediate, high school, my parents decided to grab a computer and sort of learn how to program from there.
What type of computer was it?
Do you want to know detailed specifications?
I think I do. We'll see how the audience.
It was from PB Technologies, so that's a free plug for PB Technologies. But I remember we bought it. It was like, I don't know, it was just a packaged computer and it was running Windows 98 or something like that. Something prehistoric, something that made it really painful to learn how to program on. But yeah, I just started to learn to program on that. So by the time I got to university, I could actually program really well, and it was already sort of a thing that I knew that I wanted to pursue in some way.
And so that led into freelancing and doing engineering, software engineering.
Yeah, so all through high school, I never actually had a real job. A friend of mine wrote some software that was like email based, and it ended up being quite popular, and he got bought out, and so I always used to get freelance gigs from him. And I remember the first freelance gig I ever did was fixing up a spreadsheet for a nail and bolts company in Texas. I basically got like this Excel spreadsheet that had like a whole bunch of code in it to basically generate invoices based on how many, I kid you not, Texas nails you bought. And it had a bug in it, and they were just like, we need someone somewhere in the world to fix this spreadsheet because our entire business is operating on it, which was terrifying to really think about that actually, because they were doing some serious volume. I mean, it's like a Texas company. So.
Yeah. And did they go well?
Yeah, I mean, I got more work from Terry, my friend.
Yes.
Yeah, so whenever I needed money, I would just do a little contract, and it's actually how I developed a lot of kind of the professional skills I have, I guess. Yeah.
And so did that lead into, so once you learned how to program and had built up some experience freelancing, did that lead to Pocket Logistics? Pocket Logistics, is that what it's called?
Actually, a couple of friends and I got together and decided to start an internet cafe, which slowly turned into a build-to-order PC company, as you do. So we actually learned like the base level of entrepreneurship. We were using MYOB in its original form to learn about the basics of running a business, GST, taxes, how all of that stuff.
That wasn't a sponsored comment.
That wasn't, no. That was, actually, can I get paid for that? No. I'll take an extra beer. No. But yeah, no, we kind of worked together as a partner, a bunch of partners, kind of in a traditional business sense, but we were like 15 at the time. So yeah, like it was a good fun time, and I remember actually that was one of the really most interesting kind of learning experiences that we had, because we were just winging it. Like, we were literally like looking at other businesses and going, they have a company car. I wonder how much that would cost. They seem to have an office. It has tables and chairs. We should look into tables and chairs. And it was weird, because we would quickly figure out that like the operating costs of businesses, you know, of a typical business was this, and you could afford this, and how profit and loss and balance sheets and stuff worked. So that was quite an early kind of accidental finding that led on to Pocket Logistics.
And what was Pocket Logistics?
So when I wasn't at lectures at uni, I was actually working for doing more contracting, and I'd landed in this startup company called Unimarket, and they did finance, finance e-procurement software. So they were just in the startup phase, pre-revenue. They were run by a former EY partner, Scott Blackwood, who was technically my first boss, and I was their first employee. So I redid all their front end, and then when an opportunity came for them to integrate with the University of Waikato's finance system, which was like Oracle and some big legacy system, they were like, I guess Danu can do it, because I was basically the only option. So I ended up integrating that system and becoming their first employee. And then off the back of that, their entire value proposition was that the more customers that you have, the cheaper procurement costs for like regular things like paper and software and all kinds of stuff becomes for group purchasing, basically. The company started to grow off the back of that first integration. So I became kind of cornerstone employee, saw the company grow to about 7 or 8 staff. I handled a lot of the US integration, so I became the integration guy. For some reason, probably because I had seen a lot of Excel spreadsheets by that point. And from that, I decided after about 2 years of doing that and finishing up the degree that I actually wanted to do something else. And And a friend of mine, Kerry, who's actually in the audience, showed me this thing called an iPhone, and I was like, whatever. Like, you know, he's an ultimate Apple fanboy. This guy cannot shut up about Apple. But at the time, he showed me like an Apple webpage, an Apple iPhone running a full desktop webpage, like without batting an eyelid.
Yeah.
And I was like, people are going to want to play games on that. So basically, that was the original idea for Rush.
Yeah.
And in between, I met one of my old business partners and good friends, Matt Cunningham, who was the CIO at DigiPost, which is a post-production company. So he gave me some regular contract work. I built out a whole bunch of data center software and did some of the support for their data center. And in that time, we kind of formed a company around vehicle tracking. I can't really remember exactly how it came about, but there was, like Navman Wireless at the time, they had like a public API that was being used for spreadsheets. Yeah,
Spreadsheet master.
spreadsheets, I'm telling you, the secret to success is just learn everything about spreadsheets and they will lead you to glory. But basically it was a reporting API. And the iPhone was kind of new, but had started a bit in, and a lot of managers of these small fleets, like plumbers, or even logistics companies, freight companies, courier companies, really wanted to be able to see where all their vehicles were, especially because they had paid such a large amount of money to track all their vehicles, so they could get this intelligence, but it was only available on desktop. And at the time, Navman Wireless were the largest vehicle tracking company in the world. And this public API was just sitting there, and we happened to have a friend who was also in the vehicle tracking space, and he put us onto this, and we founded a company around it, and we built a mobile tracking app. So basically, we just duplicated, like, there's probably like 50 different features on the desktop version. We just duplicated 2, which was, where is the asset, and can I send it a message, basically. And the API supported this. We managed to build a system in a pretty short amount of time, a matter of months. And just before we launched it, Navman Wireless said, hey, we'd like to actually just launch that ourselves, so we'll just buy it off you. And that was that.
What was that process like? That was a great answer to what is pocket logistics.
Thanks. Yeah, that was at this point, I was probably like 23. And I had never been through anything remotely like that before. So they just like put out a number, and from my haggling in Sri Lanka, like my practice trying to buy a wallet for like 1/10 the price to replace the one I lost on the beach. Basically, it was just like, double it, got a deal. And, yeah, they did. And okay.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, those are all the experiences that kind of just spilled up to learning.
Now, would you say quadruple it?
Yeah. No, I mean, honestly, like we got a really great deal.
Yeah.
And actually, like I think Navman Wireless got more out of it because they were looking for something to justify the move to mobile.
And so did they actually launched it? They didn't just like,
Yeah, they took it
acquire
back
squash
and
it.
they rebranded as Online AVL 2, which was their product was called Online AVL, and they basically just rebranded it Online AVL 2 and put it out there. And I think a version of it is still used today. That would have been like 2010, 2009, something like that. So very early on. Yeah.
One thing, like as you were explaining that story, there's always been something I've found about you is when you're explaining a concept, whether it's like highly technical or just moderately technical, you've got a way of explaining it in layman's terms, like that. I think probably everyone here understood that completely. Where do you think that came from?
It was definitely from explaining how to use a spreadsheet to people. No, I think through growing up in South Auckland, growing up through like a diverse community, being like living in lots of different countries and coming to technology very late, I think, and also having a little bit of and maybe the reason I'm not purely technical is because I came to it so late. I think I kind of have a little bit of empathy for the other side of the seat when you're trying to explain things. And I like observing things. I like to figure out how stuff works and things like that. And I think that
you've also done some work in the charity space, the non-profit space, P3. How did that come about, and what was that like?
Yeah, so the non-profit space has always been really fascinating. Actually, even our built-to-order PC company, we were always curious about why we couldn't just take the profits and kind of give them away. That was a naive, like 15-year-old kind of Captain Planet perspective of the world, but it was the seed of where the group of people that we had formed that company came from. We were very open to, we were kind of building PCs because we were gaming nerds. Like, we loved video gaming and we loved PCs and all that stuff. So we were already being rewarded, and the money was just like a bonus. So it was like, oh well, maybe we can share it around. So the idea of like social enterprise was probably just reaching populace around the time that we were going through all of that stuff. And obviously with my background, my parents coming from a third world country and then growing up in developing countries, and then I always joke that I'm the product of 3 third world countries: Sri Lanka, Zimbabwe, and South Auckland. But it does give you a different perspective of like how the world works, right? And it's like, actually, there's a lot of things that you could do, so why would you wait until you're ready to do it, as opposed to just doing it on one side? A friend of mine, Divya Da, she ended up winning Young New Zealand of the Year, 2011, and she used that sort of as a platform to start building a non-profit organisation with P3. So we sort of sat around the table. We had done a couple of charity things in the past, a couple of campaigns for Millennium Development Goals, and those Millennium Development Goals were a good kind of foundation to build charity work around. So P3, the idea was that actually the youth are already empowered to kind of do this stuff. All they really need is like an organization to self-organize and try and work forward. So P3 was one of the first like kind of youth for youth non-profits that was volunteer driven. So we founded that in 2009, and we were actively involved for a good 2 or 3 years. We managed to raise $200,000 for some villages in India, Kalimpong. We managed to get some matching from the Owen Glen Foundation. We installed water tanks in Tonga. We ran a social enterprise competition. We actually had a good 2 or 3 years of valuable fundraising, and the organization still runs today. I was a trustee for about a year and interim CEO, but then it's sort of self-running, I guess, now.
Awesome, that's really cool. I'm starting to get a good feel for what motivates you and drives you forward, which is awesome. You mentioned before playing a game on an iPhone. People are going to want to play games on an iPhone, and that was one of the reasons you started Rush. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so because I'm quite a visual person, I've always loved computer graphics. So computer graphics are the element of video games that display everything to the screen, basically. And there's actually a huge amount of math and science that goes behind making everything look really pretty. And I always loved the fact that whenever someone looked at a video game or looked at something that was computer graphics, even special effects in movies, it was so convincing that no one could understand how difficult it was to do that. And for me, that's like the beauty of engineering. Like, if you can make something work so well and be so believable that everyone thinks it's easy, that's like the penultimate goal. So I quickly found out that like computer graphics was the best place to do this, because we hadn't reached the level of realism that we are approaching today. So all through high school and stuff, all of the programming that I tried to teach myself was all around computer graphics and video games. So when the iPhone came out, there was a lot of things in the iPhone that were being done from a software, because if you look at an iPhone, it's basically the entire course of the PC compressed into like 10 years. So it's the original IBM 86, and then the clones coming out, and then all of the development of the hardware and software. So I was like, oh, okay, well, it makes sense that if the first kind of free PC software that was ever made on a PC was a video game, that eventually video games would be equally important in mobile. So when the iPhone came around and Kerry was showing me the iPhone, I was actually already developing a game engine, and I immediately just retargeted for the iPhone, and kind of felt that video games on mobile were going to be the big thing, and it was already an area of interest for me.
And so how did you go from doing this kind of like a passion project or building this game engine to turning it into a company?
Yeah, so that's an interesting path, because when I was doing it as a passion project, I actually built a couple of game engines that what I would do is there was this company called ID Software, and they made all the Quake games, the Quake 1, Quake 2, Quake 3, these are very popular games, and actually they're the foundation of a lot of video gaming today. And what I would do is like, their lead programmer, John Carmack, was like my idol. So I would just like try and figure out what he was doing, kind of like at 1998 internet, GeoCities and stuff. Try and like cyberstalk him and just be like, figure out exactly what this guy was doing, what he was doing next, and try and just be on top of him. And figuratively speaking. And I built all my game engines to kind of run and operate just like the Quake games. To the point where when I was posting screenshots online, I actually managed to get a cease and desist from ID because they thought it was their engine. And I was like, wow, I must be pretty alright at this. Like, they're confusing their stuff or the stuff I'm building. And basically, I guess that is the cornerstone of where all of, the stuff comes from for me.
So you got like an instilled like confidence from that, and you're just like, I'm gonna go and build a company.
Yeah, I mean, it just seemed like the obvious thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think I like accidentally surrounded myself with other entrepreneurial people. So like Scott Blackwood, he was very entrepreneurial. He was a pretty good project manager for EY. He was like one of the youngest people to make partner at EY in the world. So he was like a really good person to be an understudy for. So it just seemed like a thing that was in reach. And I think no one had scared me yet. So, yet. Like I had no massive commitments,
Yeah.
Like my parents had just kind of taken what seemed to be normal steps for me, but to a lot of other people might have been like uprooting your entire family, running away from like communists first, and then like running away from angry Nigerians, and then running away from angry Zimbabweans, and then coming in to New Zealand. Like all of those steps are pretty big steps. So for me, I think my risk profile, my perspective on like what a risk is, was like way different. So when someone's like, oh, you start a company, to be perfectly honest, I didn't even think about going bankrupt. Like I didn't even think about what would happen if I ended up owing, somebody a lot of money. I was just like, I'm sensible. I'm not going to over leverage myself. I'm not going to do anything silly. And I kind of just took that into starting a business. And that's always been my philosophy. It's done okay.
So who was your first customer on the platform?
National Geographic Channel, technically.
Wow.
Yeah. So
How did that come about?
there was a company. There's a documentary company in Dunedin. They basically have Nat Geo on license, and there was a game development studio there that was building. They wanted to build a game called Hound and Mouse, which is about a particular cute mouse. And they were looking for a game engine, and we were like, "Hey, we've got a game engine," and they were like, "Okay, can you help us build this?" So yeah, that was our first project on the platform.
So that was it was just with the group of entrepreneurs that you had kind of surrounded yourself with, or had at this point?
At this point, actually, it was just myself. At this point, it was just myself and a couple of employees. So I think we missed a step, right?
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
Yeah. So at university, a good friend of mine, Jacob Thompson, had introduced me to his dad, who was an angel investor. And the introduction went something like this. And you have to know Jacob. He's like this really calm, docile guy. And just so you know, he's got like 4 or 5 patents to his name in autonomous vehicles. So the guy's like a rocket scientist level intelligence, but he's so dry. And he literally comes up to me one day after like knowing the guy for like 2 or 3 years. And he's like, "Hey man," I'm like, "Hey Jake, what's up?" He's like, "What what are you going to do after uni? I was like, I don't know, probably going to start a company. He's like, cool man, is it going to be mobile? Yeah. My dad's really interested in that. You guys should meet. I was like, okay. And like I just knew Jake, so I was like, he's understating something there. And it turns out his dad is Dr. Ray Thompson, who's invested in like a squadrillion things, and had a lot of tech exits and all kinds of stuff. So I sat down with Ray and we sort of worked out putting together an information memorandum to raise money and do all that stuff. But it was really interesting because Ray could see that I was gonna go as hard as I could at whatever we ended up building. But it was very hard to get the investment scene to buy into that because it was like this 24-year-old brown kid with like a thing called a iPhone running a something, like the investment scene kind of just wasn't ready for it at the time. So we spent about 10 months trying to raise money, and in the end we only managed to get, we didn't get anyone actually. We got turned down from pretty much every angel investment group in the country, not for lack of trying, trust me. But it was just like, it was just too much risk there.
So how did you handle that? Like, were you deflated from it, or were you like, right, this doesn't matter, like, I'll just build it anyway and just carry on?
Yeah, I mean, that was the plan.
Yeah.
But Ray was like, no, let's actually just like get going. So Ray actually ended up backing me, and he managed to get some co-funding, managed to convince another angel investor to come in, and that probably shaved like 3 years off our timeline, and just completely, I don't know, probably halved our risk overnight.
Like, for that original round of funding, like, how big are we talking? Like, just in comparatively, like, understanding that in New Zealand, like, the seed round's typically kind of like 50 grand. Well, I know it's not a seed round, but
yeah,
how much?
It was a couple $100 grand for a good chunk of the company. I mean, I knew where I sat. Like, I was like, it's a 24-year-old brown kid building a something for something. Like, I was like, I was under no delusions that like I was the least investable. Like, basically, like a homeless guy could walk in and ask for less money and probably get it. Like, I was like, yeah, I'm probably on that level right now. Like, I've really got nothing to, to convince you that this is ever gonna work. It's a hunch. Yeah. So I was like, okay, we'll just go on a hunch.
And is he still involved today?
Yeah, he's still involved, and like our greatest champion.
You mentioned that you were the first employee earlier, and I've always heard that the first employee is one of the most important. Like, who was your first employee at Rush?
Ooh, first employee at Rush. A guy named Wilson Wong. Guy from Hong Kong. He had worked on the original Resident Evil for PlayStation 1. Yeah, and I was like, I'm pretty sure when I saw that on his CV, I was like, this guy. Like, I didn't think, like, when I met the guy, he spoke like 4 words of English. Like, he was like, thank you. And like, coffee. And like, goodbye. Like, that was it. And I was like, it's okay. He can code. Like, and for a good 2 months, his comments were all in like Cantonese. And I had to use like shitty 2009 Google Translate to like be like, Wilson, I really disagree with your decision here, but I don't know how to communicate it. True story, man.
That's incredible. The first Resident Evil was really good. Like,
yeah, that was the best one, right? Yeah, PlayStation 1, right?
Yeah. From that point, you obviously started ramping things up, and you're based in Auckland at this point, I'm taking it?
Yeah, I mean, we've had ebbs and flows, and we've pivoted to much more of a services company. I think that's just like more of a business model fit for the domestic market, and we got our ass handed to us by Unity. So we built a game engine that competed directly with Unity, and at the time we started, like, the value proposition was on point because Unity was about 40-odd staff at this point, and they hadn't quite made the switch to iPhone yet. They had proved that they could. They had demonstrated that it was possible. But we were actually already running on the iPhone, and we were about a year ahead in technology. But we burned up 10 months trying to secure investment, which was a huge mistake in hindsight. But Unity at the same time secured $5 million from Sequoia Capital. And I'm not sure if anyone knows who Sequoia is. They invested in like tiny little companies that went nowhere, like Apple and Google and Java and stuff like that. And so it was basically like written in the sand. And you know, in the time frame that we existed and pushed the game engine, Unity grew to a $500 million business to a $1.6 billion business. So like the bet was 100% accurate, but execution was way off. And I think one of the biggest things about that was Unity actually had like a really clearly stated product vision. They wanted to democratize game development. Like that was their, I know it. Oh, it's burned. Like it'll probably be my last words. Like when I die, it'll be like, come closer. Democratize game development. But we didn't. We had great technology, and we had like a hardcore nerd in the middle of it, able to like build good tech, but it was hard to use. So that was the difficulty. But then we sort of transitioned to this because we did such a good job of engineering. We transitioned into the service model because we had a reputation for technical excellence.
So as you started getting into services, you started working with some international clients, and from what I remember, it was like, I'm not actually going to say names of them, but you, how did you go, so that transition point, was it difficult? Sort of giving, because did you feel you had to kind of give up your products to move into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a thing that every product startup that pivots into services or is running out of money considers. It's basically like, oh, maybe we should just do services. But like, you really have to commit one way or the other. So like, if you're gonna do product, just do product and fail. Like, just go hard, go full tilt, and just like lean into it as much as you can. If you try and do both, it becomes a very difficult proposition. And there are certain companies of certain caliber, or if you've got enough war scars, you can transition from one to the other, whichever way you want to go. Usually it's from services to product. But if you want to be services, there's a whole, it's almost a totally different set of infrastructure that you have to build. So yeah, the transition was difficult because we got away with so much because we were just able to deliver. Because it was just like, you know, customers would come to us and there was no project manager, there was no account manager, there's no like P&L reporting, absolutely nothing. And there's like this Hong Kong engineer, doesn't speak 3 words of English, sitting there with your product completely finished. You know, and that was it. That was the comma in the sentence. It was like, but they knocked it out of the park.
You know, like short time
yeah,
frame, right?
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was like, that was what the reputation was built on.
So was it all primarily mobile, like through those early stages of service?
Yeah, I mean, it was a boom period. One of the first like really profitable gigs that we got was a mobile application that was taken on board by a particular developer and needed to be launched for a particular event that was stuck in stone, like the date was set in stone. And there was like a lot of large brands involved, and there was a huge commitment to finish this thing. And the developer had just royally rooted it, like, and they basically were like, started asking around town. They were like, oh, how can we recover the project? And they were like, yeah, you're gonna have to talk to Danu. So like, they came in and we were like, sure, we'll do the gig. And we just, you know, and from the Navman wireless experience, I was just like, what's the number? Quadruple it. And then they're like, okay. And I was like, oh, that worked. Like, this is interesting. There might be a business here. So that kind of formed the foundation of the services business, actually. Yeah.
Awesome. And touching back onto the international side of things, so you obviously scaled Rush to a certain point, and then we should look at international business.
Yeah. The way that kind of came about is because we were in video games. Video games has always been a really international business, and we always discussed that, and Ray always pushed me to sort of develop our international credentials and connections. So I ended up going to the Game Developers Conference every year, and that was actually prompting from Ray. He's like, you know, you should go to these conferences. This is where people like you hang out with each other and then become friends and then do business together. And I was like, oh, so that's how networking works. Thanks for the one-on-one. But basically, a lot of the games development business was overseas and international. So one of the first gigs that we really landed was just through various networks, was when Microsoft they royally screwed up Windows Phone 7, and they shuttered that product and decided, okay, we'll have another go at this and we'll do Windows Phone 8. And they ended up taking a content strategy. They took a $100 million budget a year, and they said to all of these app developers, bring all your content over to Windows Phone 8, so that when we launch this magnificent beast of a platform, we'll have all the same content. So we managed to get a connection through a local partner and Microsoft internationally. And Microsoft has always been really good to us, actually. I worked as a student partner through university. They needed a particular set of Disney games brought over to Windows Phone that a lot of other vendors wouldn't touch, because the particular game, the game in question, was called Where's My Water, and it had a whole bunch of fluid dynamics, which is complicated mathematics, that was so finely balanced that no one wanted to touch it. And the reason no one wanted to touch it is because this game had somehow managed to get 300 million downloads, like paid downloads, in the span of about a year. So anyone and everyone knew that if you touched any of this game code, this 1.5 million lines of game code, you were probably going to fuck up a huge revenue stream for Disney, the largest conglomerate in the world. So, you know, of the list of lawyers that you want to be nowhere near, like Disney is at the top of that list. But we had figured out a way to sort of build an environment around the game code so that we didn't have to touch the game code. And we proposed this and ended up winning that scope of work, and we did such a good job. I took a bet on us being able to actually fulfill the work, so I went and hired a couple of engineers that I had wanted for a while and hadn't been. I didn't even have the cash in. It was fiscally irresponsible to be quite frank, but I didn't even have the cash in the bank to make the paychecks required by Christmas. But I knew that Disney needed this stuff out, and our partner needed this stuff out by Christmas, so I just took the bet and hired in these engineers. And by the time Disney inked the contract, about 8 weeks later, we actually had it up and running on the phone. So they were super impressed, and our partner was like really happy with us, and we ended up forming a business relationship that lasted about 2 years. We ended up porting about 40 or 50 titles, and we used that to really kind of scale the business. And that was a platform, you know, we were dealing with Disney Palo Alto and Prague and all over the world to bring all the content across. So it kind of set us up with all the, like Disney and a couple of, like Microsoft and a few other companies like that we were working with through that period were already really set up for international type business, development business. So they had all their processes sus, they had all their time sheeting and all that stuff. So we kind of like learned all that stuff through osmosis and made us a little bit more comfortable kind of putting our foot overseas and being, you know, just doing business overseas.
So through that kind of growth period, was there any particular kind of like hire, like a team member that joined the business that really helped kind of get things on track?
Yeah,
or multiple?
Yeah, absolutely. Ahmed Halali rings a bell.
He's the man.
Yeah, Shane knows him. Ahmed was a great guy. I think we met at a meetup. He was working on some open source game engine. We ended up nerding out and like some kind of like rom-com. We ended up hitting it off and sort of working together on a few projects. And Ahmed was a really good engineer. He's actually one of the lead programmers for the Plug blockchain for Centrality now. He's a very talented individual. Yeah, we're still good friends.
Awesome. That point when you were almost running out of money and not being able to make paychecks,
I want to be clear, we've run out of money several times.
Yeah. That's probably something that people aren't really like, risk adverse people, yeah, get it, but people are probably afraid of that kind of thing. Like, how do you deal with that?
You bury it. I don't know. So I think like there's a big difference in running out of money and not having any cash flow.
Yeah.
So there's cash flow timing, which is just a business problem, like that's 100% solvable. And then there's like completely running out of money and like not having any income and then having a whole bunch of liabilities. So it's always about managing your downside risk, right? So I think being awake at the wheel and just being like, oh, okay, we've got a downturn coming for whatever reason. Like, you know, you've been fired, you fired a client, the economy's gone to shit, like whatever the reason is. Being aware of what you owe more than like a day ahead is super important. So I was lucky enough to be paranoid. Like the reason I'm a really good developer is because I'm super paranoid. So when I write code, I'm like, but what if this happens? And what if this happens? And what if this happens? So when I started the business, I also ran the business like that. So I was like always, oh, but what if this happens? Oh, and then I would go read up about employment law and go read up about this and that to know exactly what my exposure was. So I always had a kind of a running number in my head about what our exposure was. So for me, the discomfort probably didn't quite match what it sounded like on paper. And it would always be like, okay, if you had to shake hands and walk away, you know, what would the number be, and like how would you manage that? That was always in the back of your head. And you've got to always have like an exit strategy. An exit strategy isn't always get bought by Google, right? Like, great plan, but like there are about 90,000 other permutations that can happen. So knowing your more likely ones and keeping those front of mind and keeping those plans current is pretty important, I guess.
That's good advice. You also replaced yourself as the CEO of the company. Why did you do that?
I got some good advice. A bit of self-reflection. It was an analytical decision to some degree as well. So when we got that big scope of work, I needed somebody to be able to handle all of the technical oversight for all of the Disney stuff and the Microsoft stuff. So I had one of my good friends out of Becker's defense contracting company, Guy Sherman, who's our former CTO. He's now the CTO of like a $200 million startup, best guy ever, and his name's Guy, so you know, puns galore. But basically, that was the first step for me, like giving up some of my responsibility. So I trusted him because we had been project partners through university and we were actually really good friends. So I trusted him. He was actually going to start Rush with me, but he was risk averse and wanted to work at Becker, and then ended up building their entire like defense simulator business off like stuff that we had designed at university, which was awesome. But then he ended up coming back to Rush, and he was, I could trust him 100%. So I had no hesitation giving up my responsibilities technically, because I knew he was a better engineer than me. So I was like, oh, okay, cool. And that was the first taste I got of, oh, actually I'm not like just doing the CEO job 50% of the time. Like, yeah, I'm okay at it, but if I could free up more of my time, then I can do more of it at a better quality, right? So I guess when the opportunity came and the business was scaling and, you know, our sort of plans had changed, it wasn't that foreign to me to go, okay, by this time Guy had left, he'd moved to the UK, and we didn't have a CTO in play. So I knew that actually to the business, I was more valuable as a CTO than I was as a CEO. And that's not to discount what Pav does. It's more to say that I'm not trained as a CEO, I'm not a natural CEO, much more of a natural technologist and an engineer. And that's actually where that's my batting range, right? So Pav, his batting range is management and being a CEO and coming from that background. So it just made sense, really, when that was proposed, that was actually going to be a good thing for the company.
And how has it changed the company since that kind of transitional point?
It's improved the dynamic. I can't emphasize how good it is to have a good challenge back and not have to kind of have an understanding of where your responsibility lies and fight for those needs for the business, and then have an equally well-formed argument back as to why you can't do something, it sounds counterintuitive, but like if you imagine one person doing all of this stuff, you're gonna go crazy. Like by definition, you're just having this like 5 different hats arguing in your head. Eventually you're gonna blurt something out at dinner and people are gonna think you're nuts. Because you're literally going, oh, we need to do this, but I can't afford it, but I need people to do this, and the P&L says this, and it's just this constant conversation, and it's very stressful, it's disorganized, it's really hard, and you have to basically be Steve Jobs to pull it all down in an articulate manner.
Yeah. Okay, I've got two more questions, and then we'll open up to the audience. So if you've got a burning question or something, you can ask Danu. What's next for Rush?
So we've made the transition. So we started out as a cockroach, which is basically work for hire spec build engineering company. Ironically, the hardest, what I feel is the hardest bit of the pipeline, has been commoditized globally, which is engineering. The life cycle of the company, we've gone and tried to move up the value chain. So we've just transformed to an integrated design and technology studio. So competitive advantage is the integrated keyword.
So we're competing now, right?
Yeah,
Pixel
we're
Fusion
competitors.
and
Yeah. I'm glad to be here, by the way. But yeah, an integrated design tech studio. So I think we've always talked about intellectual property. So we're looking at building out IP and trying to do the transition that I talked about. That was very hard to do, into an IP-based company that's more services and IP.
And if you were to start a new company right now, like what is exciting you from like a technology standpoint, or where would you start a company right now if you were to have a clean slate?
That's a really good question. This one kept me up at night, actually. It does keep me up at night. We've got a lot of challenges coming up as a generation, as a company. This sounds cliche, but as a company, to solve those problems does seem like a good way of actually achieving the outcomes, because the way that our society is kind of set up is we're okay with a capitalist approach to solving problems. So it's a kind of a hybrid approach, because the ideal approach is everyone just bands together and we do it on goodwill, but good luck getting that done. But like a more capitalist approach, like what Elon's doing with Tesla and SpaceX and stuff, is definitely an interesting way to go forward. And we have some huge problems around plastics and alternate fuel sources, and we have a lot of countries coming online, developing countries, that are also going to be working towards solving a lot of these problems, because they're actually much more relevant to them. So I think you'll find like India and a lot of developing countries have banned the use of single-use plastics, which Western countries are lagging on. But these developing countries can see that if they don't move now, they're going to have a huge problem, an insurmountable problem in 20 years. So I think it's in the cusp of where those countries are coming online in terms of wanting to be developed nations. There's a huge business opportunity, because they don't carry any of the legacy that our nations do. So, for example, in Africa, mobile payments, for us, it's like fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating to watch that. Like, we think mobile payments is a natural evolution of payments. If you go to Africa, mobile payments is the only way you pay. It's because they just couldn't, they've skipped a couple of generations of technology, they've skipped a couple of generations of legacy. So actually there's entirely new opportunities sitting there, waiting to be unlocked, because we're sort of on the cusp of the flick over for a lot of these countries coming into productive GDPs and things like that. Does that answer it? Energy, fossil fuels.
It does.
It
definitely narrows it down to specific types of problems. Cool. Does anyone in the audience have a question? Hands up. Cool. Question.
Hi, I'm Gabe.
I get it.
Thanks for your talk. Really informative. I'm going to go on a hunch here based off everything you just spoke about. Surely at some point in time you were like, maybe we should make our own game.
Yeah.
Please tell.
We don't talk about that. I'm not a game developer. So we've tried to build games, and we're just not good at it. Like, it's kind of like getting a whole bunch of like mag and wheel specialists to build a bus. You know what I mean? Like, they would like rock the shit out of the wheels, but the rest of the bus is probably questionable.
But surely, I feel like you're a mag wheel specialist, but you also like to drive the bus.
Yeah, absolutely. No, 100%. But then we end up focusing on the wrong stuff. So that was the thing that I noticed. We actually, so we had a really good shot at building a video game, and it was never an aspiration. So I think that was a really important thing to recognize. Like, the company never aspired to build a video game. Like, my nature and the company's nature is to be an enabler, build platforms to allow other people to express their creativity, and that was always the goal. So it was always about make the thing better and make it more powerful, make it more flexible. Which we were missing one more thing: make it easier to use, which would take to my grave. But we had kind of a funny story. So I went to GDC one year, and we finally felt like the tech was okay enough to kind of like pull off a really good looking game. We had a lot of flexibility. We finally had it running on like 4 different platforms with one build system, right? So we could hit build and we could go on iOS, Android, Windows Phone. I know you can laugh about that right now, but back then it was a big deal. And Apple TV, I think. The goal was, we had this game called Drift Legends, which was like a fun drifting game, very difficult curve, but it was fun, and organically had a few downloads, and we had done it in partnership with a drifting car magazine, bought the rights to that, and then went to GDC, and I met with the BBC, and I met the licensing officer for BBC Top Gear. So the idea was we would get the Top Gear license, right? And we would build a drifting game around Top Gear, and that would be that. So we met with the BBC, we were like, we had heads of terms, we were like, cool, let's go ahead and start building this game. We started building the game, and we got the license, and I went back to GDC and met with Grant, the BBC licensing director at the time, and we'd shook on it, we'd signed all the paperwork, everything was done. I get back to New Zealand, and Clarkson fucking punched that producer the next day. And just everything went downhill from there. I was like, okay, well, this is a sign, like, it's never gonna work. So we ended up building a good game. It was fun, but we just didn't have the execution needed. It was technically excellent, but the game wasn't great. So we just kind of, at that point, we're just like, you know what, like, we're gonna bow out of this. We're gonna focus on where our revenue and customers want us, and we'll regroup and have another stab at it later, or we'll do something else that'll be just as fulfilling.
Okay, thanks very much for sharing the story. At the beginning, you talked about how you've never really had a real job, and then you set up your own company. How do you feel like you set up the company or culture differently because you haven't necessarily had to unlearn some stuff from a more corporate or a professional career path?
That's a very interesting question. So the thing that I did was I just duplicated the environment that led to the good work that we did at university. So we built a lot of like software at university and made a lot of friends, and that gives you a good sense of kind of the environment that engineers like being in and the types of problems that they like solving. So I just didn't really overthink it too much. And I think a lot of light touch advice from Ray and friends that we had hired in. So we kind of took the best parts of the processes and experiences that those people had, and we're like, yeah, that kind of works, or that kind of makes me uncomfortable as an engineer, so we're not going to include that. So it was kind of like a cobbled together thing, but I think the vision was always that we just were a group of people that really like solving problems, so we just focused on that, I guess. Yeah, and I think it has to do with like the personality of leadership. I can't say that I'm particularly structured.
I don't know, what does your board look like, and how has that changed over time?
Our board right now is really light. It's basically myself and Ray and Pavan. Pavan is an executive board member. So we are looking to expand out the board, just based on like what we're trying to achieve, and we're just deciding what the right fit for that is. The board has changed a little bit over time, and actually we've had board members that were past shareholders. We've had board members that were brought on purely for advice, and ran previous game studios or ran other technology companies. And it just changes organically, I guess. Like after someone does 1 or 2 years with you, they always have, you know, different career goals and things like that. So there's a natural progression. And also as the company evolves and grows, your requirements at a board level change dramatically as well. So like a couple of the best decisions that we ever made were bringing on Mitch Olsen very early on. He kind of added a bit of shape to the board and he helped me on the ground a little bit more where Ray couldn't, because at the time Mitch was running a company called Small Worlds, which was at the time quite a decent sized game company, and they had taken investment from Disney Ventures and a few other things. So he brought a little bit of entrepreneurial discipline, which was really good. And then we also, for a short stint, we had a guy named Daryl Singh, who was at the time the CTO of a company called Pure Depth, and then he inherited the CEO position, which is why he left our board. But he did something really great, which was, it's hard to say, but he basically like put the final nail in the coffin for the game engine. So he went along and kind of did a study of like how revenue performance was going and like what our customers really wanted, whether the market had moved, whether there was really an opportunity there. And in like 2 or 3 months of coming on board, he, you know, clearly articulated why we shouldn't be doing this and why we should be pursuing something else. So yeah, I mean, I think boards change over time, and I think getting the right person for where you're at, and then making sure that they don't stay around forever, because the nature of that type of oversight role is you're so far from the detail that actually you need to stay at that high level, and then for you to stay effective, you need to rotate off, basically, because everything down here is changing constantly because of what you've advised, but getting a clear picture back up isn't necessarily easily possible.
We've got one more question.
This will be good.
I'm as loud as Angus on the mic. So you switched from product to services. You ever go back to product?
Yeah, definitely want to go back to product. Services is great, and it actually gives you a fantastic view of the landscape. So I think what we've experienced is that we've managed to join forces with lots of different companies and see what problems they face. So I think that, like, if we were to go through a mapping exercise and say, hey, these are all our businesses, these are all our business partners, and they're all in these verticals, and these are the problems that we're helping them solve, or they're actively articulating need solving, then out of that you can kind of form a canvas of like what a product might be. But we've got a couple of products that we're developing internally that one of them we're going through a patent discovery phase, so we're doing freedom to ship, freedom to operate, and then another one we've got a teaming agreement with a large corporate to actually turn into a sort of a separate startup. So those we're hopeful, but we also know that it's pretty difficult to distract yourself from services and go to products, and the transition is going to be very difficult, but the world's kind of changed a lot as well.
Thanks for that, Danu. Something I prepared earlier is a gift to say thank you.
Thanks, man.
Can I get a round of applause for Danu?